You're watching StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh Revi, and it's great to see from New York, Arvind Panagariya. He's a professor of economics and the Jagdish Bhagwati Professor of Indian Political Economy at Columbia University, and of course, India's first NITI Aayog Vice Chairperson. Thank you so much for your time, Professor Panagariya.
Very happy to be with you, Amitabh.
Professor Panagariya, just wanted to get your thoughts on China, breaking all international norms and rules of procedure in so many dimensions, whether it's a military, economic, trade, technology, especially post what happened in Galwan.
Well, yeah, we really have a very aggressive and belligerent neighbor. We have to live with it. But most certainly, China's ambition is to be the world power, and not just world power, which it already is, but to be the number one power. So it would like to displace the United States. But before it does that, it has to become the regional number one power. And, India is an obstacle to that ambition. And so I think going forward, we are going to have a bit of tough neighborhood, and we will need to deal with it.
Professor Panagariya, already both suggesting that the Indian government would say ban Huawei for its 5G technology. There are, of course, so many concerns, whether it's espionage, whether it's spying, whether it's data, or whether it's reliance on Chinese technology in a strategic sphere. Would you recommend that kind of reaction from India?
Yeah. So I have said this, that, wherever there is a direct security threat, and certainly 5G would fall into that category, India should actually take the necessary action. You can't compromise the national security. I don't recommend starting a full-scale, full-blown trade war with China, and we can talk about that. But wherever there is a direct threat to security, I think we do need to take the necessary defensive action.
So, for example, the banning of the Chinese apps, and we've seen Mike Pompeo and the United States is probably similarly following in that fashion. Is that more symbolic, or is that also substantive in terms of a security threat?
See, I'm not, a cyber specialist on this, so I mean, I can only go by what I hear, and from the reactions both in the United States and India, the sense I get is that there was a bit of security threat in these apps as well, and that being the case, I think India did the right thing.
As you were pointing out, the approach that India should take in terms of trade retaliation is it should be more what? Do you say calibrated so that it doesn't end up shooting ourselves in the foot?
Yes. I think we need to be a little more calibrated. I think that's exactly right word. I do think that in longer run we need to reorient our trade away from China and towards other countries, but we should not do it in a way that hurts ourselves, and doing it by restricting imports from China with by whatever means, higher tariffs on China or higher tariffs on everybody on goods that get imported from China. I don't think that will be in our own personal interest. The way to reorient trade is to make trade with the other countries more attractive, and that can be done by forging free trade agreements with other trading partners, such as the European Union, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia. Down the road, hopefully, United States also. I think geopolitically, we should do it first with the United States.
Right.
But I think economically, that's a tough task, because US is super competitive in agriculture. And we got an agricultural sector, which I think politically is going to be very challenging to open up. I think economically, I think our farmers can compete, but it would require some restructuring and so forth. But I think politically, I doubt that we'll take that risk. So I think first build up a bit of a confidence by forging agreements with European Union, United Kingdom, because there is no agriculture threat, threat to agriculture. There is none of that from European Union or the UK. And in other matters also, I think US also likes to, in its FTAs, have very high standards of labor, so labor standards, intellectual property standards, even environmental standards, and so forth. Whereas in the case of European Union, I think we won't have those obstacles. So that's a doable agreement. It still requires some courage, meaning we have to open our own markets on things like the automobiles. But that I think is in our interest. I mean, we have protected long enough the automobile sector. Give them a 10-year timetable. Or 15-year timetable for that matter, that each year you knock down 10% of the tariffs or 8% of the tariffs and move accordingly to the free trade agreement. So it can be done with sufficient phase-out period. But we need to start there, because otherwise we are going to have our trade suffer. And trade really is very, very important in growing the economy at very high growth rates.
Professor Panagariya, you're talking about the US, and now there's a lot of realignment with the US because of China. And when you're talking about trade and the agreement there, the minister himself recently said, we're just a couple of phone calls away from at least a limited trade agreement. But we've been hearing that for so long. So I do take your words. But when you're talking about agreements, I think you've changed your mind, say, vis-a-vis RCEP because of how China is dealing with international rules and the rule-based order?
Yes, I did actually, because originally I thought we should have an agreement with China, meaning we should sign off on RCEP. And the thinking was that, RCEP market consisting of about 16 countries was a very large market. And as we try to attract the multinationals to our shores, access to that very large market would be pivotal. It will make us a very attractive location for the multinationals that move out of China or want to diversify out of China. That was my thinking. But after Galwan, I felt that India could no longer trust China. And therefore, even if we were to do RCEP eventually, because, Chinese Communist Party has this habit of, mixing up everything from defense to foreign policy to economic policy. And in the end, whatever it takes, they will take the action. And so in that sense, if we get very heavily kind of invested in RCEP and therefore with China, then we become vulnerable to Chinese economic sanctions and other kinds of actions. And if we could trust in the way I think we can trust the United States, European Union on those matters, even if they were to get upset or they had some domestic interests, I think their actions are not going to be large. These will be piecemeal, small actions against us. But China can take very large actions, and that can be very, very disruptive. So for that set of reasons, I decided that we really need to decouple from China, but in a gradual fashion.
In a gradual fashion, and when you're talking about disruption now, apart from how China has been behaving, COVID, there's been a lot of movement of, or at least policy makers looking at moving supply chains out of China. Japan announced a big $2+ billion deal package for their own firms. How well placed is India to take advantage of that, take the opportunity that has been given both by COVID and how China is behaving?
We have some advantages, but we also have some disadvantages. And on balance, I think we are able to punch well below our real potential. Right now, there's much greater movement towards Vietnam, towards Bangladesh, even some to Cambodia, Thailand, and so forth. I really think we need to change that. So that, of course, means removing many of the barriers that foreign enterprises face in India as they start setting up businesses. There have been in news, for instance, one of the key problems most multinationals don't see gets resolved is that of land. That our land markets have become so inflexible and so difficult. And unless we solve these problems, these are all solvable problems. And I have argued, one way to try to begin solving it is to create some, at least half dozen or so, these autonomous employment zones, where you take, these are not like the kinds of little zones we did previously, called the special economic zones. You need an area of, 300 to 500 square kilometers, very large area. Some of it may be already built up and there may be businesses operating, which is okay. And then you declare that to be autonomous zone and give a lot of flexibility to the local administration in the matter of labor laws, in the matter of land laws, in the matter of international trade, facilitate that also movement of goods in and out. 2 or 3 of these you can locate near the deep dredge ports. We have those in Gujarat. We got those in Orissa. We got that in Andhra. So, there are a number of possible locations. And we sort of, begin to bring these multinationals there. Once you create a little bit of buzz around the multinationals being able to operate in a very friendly environment, that will then build on itself very quickly. I mean, we have other advantages. We got the labor supply very much available. Our corporate profit tax for the manufacturing firms will now be 17% only. That's as low as Singapore. So, we do have a lot of advantages, but we are simply not able to translate that into a real substantial kind of investment by multinationals because of some of these other problems.
When you're talking about COVID again, Professor, I mean, both the shock, the medical shock and the economic shock, the lockdown, what is your assessment of how the Indian government has handled it with all the policy measures that they have announced?
Yeah. No, I have generally approved of, I think they have done the right things. I was not in this, not a member of the school which was saying that, go in a massive way with fiscal stimulus and so forth and let the fiscal deficit, go through the roof. I did not recommend that. There was no need at the time. But the argument is very simple. Look, when there is such a massive supply shock, no matter how much demand stimulus you might give, it's not going to generate supply response because people are not there to work. It's only after people return to work and supply, so if I can use a little bit of economist jargon, if the supply curve is completely vertical, then the supply is fixed. No matter where the demand is, increasing demand will only translate into higher prices, nothing more, because the supply cannot respond. It's just, and that's the sort of situation we were in at the time. And thankfully, the government did that right thing, and it also, provided enough cash flow channels. I think, in both the RBI relaxed its rules and lowered the interest rates and other things, and the government also came forward with that 3 trillion rupee program for the MSMEs, where they said we'll cover both principal and interest for the banks. And that sort of ensures that the banks do begin to lend to the firms, because you don't want the firms that are solvent, that are viable in the longer run, to go away or disappear, go bankrupt purely because there is no cash flow. And so I think they did the right thing. We might down the road, we will actually need more funds. Once supply response is possible, then you may need a bit of demand stimulus. But even more importantly, now there is a story in The Economist in the current issue that the banks are going to have problems because some of the firms will not make some of their loans will become non-performing, and therefore there will be need to recapitalize the banks. So the government will need these resources. If the government had fired everything it had, at the beginning, then it would be much harder. Then because debt to GDP ratio already with what we have right now is predicted to go up from 72% to 85%. Now, ultimately, remember that in the future, if your debt gets very large, the government's interest payments will get very large. And so the government will be left with nothing enough to spend on anything else. The infrastructure spending will have to be cut. All the future other productive investments that the government has to do, even on education and health, they may have to suffer down the road, because if the interest payments become so large because your debt has grown to 110% of the GDP, you have some serious issue.
Professor Panagariya, what are your thoughts on the jobs market, especially in COVID, in such a changed environment, and the new generation and its worries about how they come into the job market? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, see, for India, the job issue is a very. I mean, if you look at my recent book, India Unlimited, it is all about growth and jobs. And what I talk about is the good jobs. See, we got jobs. I mean, in the end, there was a lot of this press coverage about 6% unemployment rate. But, as things go, 6% is the natural rate of unemployment in most countries, so it's not a big deal. Where our problem is the underemployment. People are employed in very low productivity jobs, so their wages are very low, because everybody is very poor, and just to get the 2 square meals, you got to do something. So they're employed, but they're employed in very low productivity jobs. And this is where I have been arguing that we need to take a lot of policy action that will allow the emergence of medium and large firms in labor-intensive sectors like apparel, footwear, furniture, a lot of light manufacturers. These are the kinds of products that China, exports in enormous large volumes. We ought to be doing that. That will get the jobs for the people who are for the masses, so to say. That people who are not highly skilled. Because remember, in the cities and so forth, urban areas, we will be thinking of these high-tech jobs, the startups will create, and the jobs that, but that's not where most of India is. For most of India, they're very low level of skills or no skills whatsoever. But, for things like apparel, footwear, you can train workers very quickly, 6 weeks, 8 weeks. And if we got medium and large firms, they can begin to capture the global markets, which is endless. This is the domestic market. In the end, remember that China is today $14 trillion economy. We are still only $2.5 trillion. So we are not small, but at the end of the day, for our population, we are really small. And if you want to create good jobs, you have to actually penetrate in a very big way the global market. Now, apparel market is easily $800-900 billion, the export market alone. We are exporting less than 20 billion today. So get at least 10% of that, right? If you get, that's easily 80 billion if you get 10% of that market. And that gets you a lot of very good jobs. And once these jobs begin to happen, labor market will begin to tighten up for the smaller firms. Then they have to become efficient also. The tightening of the labor market. Right now, the labor market is so much slack in it that companies operate on a very low productivity, give low wages, and that's the equilibrium. We need to break that.
When you're talking about potential, Professor Panagariya, something that is after your heart and which you worked a lot on, and even when you were vice chairperson of NITI Aayog, and you wrote so much about it also, is education. And the new education policy, I think you're pretty satisfied with.
Higher education, very good. Actually, a lot of the things that I had written, I have a long chapter in the book, new book, India Unlimited. Chapter 10 is all devoted to higher education. And I looked at the US, UK, and Chinese systems, and from that I sort of decided what would be a good system for us. And the higher education policy, to a very large degree, incorporates the suggestions I had made there. So I'm very happy on the higher education front. School education, there's some very good ideas. But there is a very difficult problem, politically difficult problem, which remains, and that has really not been addressed in the policy. I can see why it has not been addressed, but I think somewhere we will have to bite that bullet. The problem is this, that, in the public sector, we are spending huge sums of money on education. If you look at it, on health, we are spending very little. But education, we are doing 4%. We are now saying we'll raise it 4 to 6%. Well, we need to rethink this, because where are we spending bulk of the 4% currently that we are spending? So maybe 3% is on school education, some of it, the rest may be on higher education and so forth. But on school, still 3% is a very large sum of money, for our kind of economy. Most of it is going on teacher salaries. Most of it is going on teacher salaries. Now, the return that we are getting on these teacher salaries is incredibly low. Because, if you look at two-thirds of our elementary schools apparently have less than 100 students.
Yeah.
And on average, it's probably more like, 45, 50. And so when you begin to think, what is my class size here? And 20% are anyway absent most of the time. So if you look at the average class size on any day in these schools, in these two-thirds of public elementary schools, we are talking like 7 or 8 students. That's even even pedagogically, these are too small classes that are too small. And economically, of course, it is very costly because per pupil, you're spending huge sums of money on teacher salary. And so, if you, and the policy says that we should hire more teachers. More teachers is not the solution, actually, because there's plenty of teachers. If you look at the pupil to teacher ratio, it's less than 30, actually. Even the RTE law that we passed in 2010 or implemented in 2010, passed in 2009, that law says 30 pupils per teacher. And we in most places, actually, even at nationally, we have that ratio already. It's a matter, the problem arises because you got too many schools which have emptied out. So, then if you're less than 50 students, you still got to have 2 teachers.
Sure.
And that's the problem. So something needs to be done on that. I don't think the current policy has addressed that particular problem. On others, I think it's good ideas, about foundational learning. We need to do that. Vocational, that's, I think, very pleased finally. This is something at NITI Aayog is arguing very much, that vocational, we do this skilling separately outside. And that doesn't work, actually. I was very influenced by the Taiwanese model. Taiwanese had included vocational, I'm going back to 60s and 70s and 80s, when Taiwan really grew at 9-10%. They had incorporated vocational training or vocational education as a part of their school and college education. So that removes the stigma of any kind. And, to some degree, I feel after I came to America, I felt very much that, everyone should have some little bit of vocational skills. Because here in the beginning, because the plumbing, electricity, they're also expensive, that we try to learn to fix ourselves. And I think, that's the thing. So that'll be useful for everybody, actually. So it should be available in the schools and colleges.
On the larger issue of the trajectory of the global economy and how it's all moving, globalization. Now, again, with COVID and streams of nationalism in different countries as well, a lot of inward-looking thought, which is being put into practice. How do you see that moving forward in terms of globalization and COVID? It should be the reverse, right? I mean, there should be more globalization rather than inward protectionist tendencies.
Yes. Now, there is a lot of the impact of the COVID itself. That, for example, the travel has completely stopped right now.
Of course.
And so that's purely COVID effect. On trade, much of what was happening policy-wise had already happened before COVID. I mean, these were the trade war
accelerated maybe because of COVID.
But in terms of the action between China and the US, and this is really confined to China and the US. The rest of the world has not gone out on, only thing that US had done on against other trading partners were the steel and aluminum tariffs, which it imposed on some of the other trading partners also, but the rest of it was all between the US and China. So in that sense, I'm not very worried. What we will need, however, once things normalize with COVID and all, something will have to be done at the World Trade Organization because that institution right now is not functioning very well. Particularly, there is a dispute settlement body which which needs at least 3 judges to operate, and right now they've been reduced to 2. And the US has a lot of complaints that it is not treated well at the WTO. So something I think will need to be done there, because that's an institution that has served the world very, very well. And even before the WTO came into existence, its predecessor institution, the GATT, General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, that had served the world for 50 years beautifully, and the international trade has grown so much more. If you go back, look at, we think that globalization is under attack, but if you look at what has happened to trade flows, merchandise trade alone used to be like, around 2000, used to be maybe 6 billion or 7 billion, about that.
Look at it now.
Today, that's about 19, 20 billion. Now, COVID may have impacted, so my figure is for 2019. 2019, sure. So the level of trade was more than ever. The rate of growth has declined a bit, but it has not stopped growing. And for us, the big question is not whether that grows or not. Big question for us, can we get a larger slice of whatever pie is there? Our share in merchandise trade is just 1.7%. Too low. China is 12 to 13. If we can get even to 4 to 5%, that will be a true miracle for us. That's what we should target. But that's where I think, policy-wise, we are going a little bit back, because, we have gone back into this import substitution policy, which had failed for us for 40 years from 1950 to 1990. 1991 is when we began to then move away from that. But I think last 3 years, the present government is sort of a government I have worked with, and it has done all the good things, all the right things. But in the area of trade, which is my core area actually as a researcher and professor, there I think we are going in the wrong direction. I really hope that we can change our direction in that area.
Professor Arvind Panagariya, again, thank you so much for such rich insights and your time, of course.
My pleasure, Amitabh. Thanks for having me.
And just a reminder to our viewers, if you want to get the latest news and analysis from an Indian perspective, just log on to our website, StratNews Global. Follow our social media handles, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And just click on that bell icon on YouTube if you want to get reminders for when we put videos up like this one. You've been watching a special interview with Dr. Arvind Panagariya. I'm Amitabh Revi.